You're not getting any movie stars in Sheffield. It's such a competitive environment that people almost thrive off other people's failures.
So I started off in the Magic Circle, where it was kind of like a melting pot of the highest achievers you're ever going to meet. I get there, massive imposter syndrome, feeling like I'd somehow mistakenly been given the ticket, like, oh, how did we let her in there? How did she sneak in the back door? I was waiting to be found out.
Had I been in your situation from the offset, started my career in a crazy, massive, cool firm like that, I might be telling you a different story.
When he was like, oh yeah, so I've got offers from like A&O, CC, Linklater, Thrushfields, and it just went like on and on. I was just like, he was like, yeah, I don't know I just don't know which one to accept.
We need to create a more compassionate environment, a more supportive culture.
You tear yourself to shreds because you think, I didn't do that thing perfectly.
I just want to say, so when I worked in law, my view of failure was quite different to my view of failure now as I'll call myself an entrepreneur. And the reason for this, I think, stems from school. Like, you do exams and you either pass or fail or whatever. And it's all on like a point system. And it's like you either right or wrong for a lot of stuff. This comes into law as well, and in a job, and you do tasks, and if you don't do it 100% correct, if it's not perfect, it's pretty much a failure. Like, for example, when I worked in immigration, I would write out immigration advice, and immigration is such a technical subject that you are either right or wrong. Obviously, I know it's super in depth and it's super crazy, and the rules are just so confusing and they change all the time. So when I was like trying to structure like emails to clients, giving advice, every single email that I wrote would be checked by a manager in the beginning, which is, absolutely spot on, like fair, no props. That's how you learn. But if there was like slightly bits wrong, or it was like, oh, no, you need to check this rule, or that's not quite correct, or whatever, which all comes with the learning process, you feel like a massive, massive failure. Like, oh gosh, I've not got it spot on. But then you don't give yourself the leeway of being like, well, in actual fact, this is a massive legal area. The rules are so complicated that I'm just learning. Whereas when I switch it to me now, I see everything is one massive experiment, like we were talking about in another water cooler episode. And it's like everything now is just a learning process. Everything is learning, and the outcomes are not necessarily failures or successes. And sometimes the successes are not necessarily even successes. They're just something that's a result of something that's happened. Whereas the failures are more of the lessons, which turn into more successes. So it's like failure and success become kind of one in a way. I don't know what you think about that, Helen.
I think you just put that so well. I think we see failure and success often as opposite things. They're not opposite at all. I think, with that, there's already this idea of judgment. This is good, this is bad, this is a success, this is a failure. At the end of the day, things just are as they are. And if you want to reach a certain point, you have to try out a whole bunch of things in order to get the expertise and the knowledge to be able to be at that point. Now, if that means you had to try something 10 times and find different ways of doing it, then that's what it took. I'm not really sure why we have to have this lens of success and failure. And I think some of it comes from the fact that as lawyers, it's highly competitive and we view the world as a zero-sum game. So that means either you win or you lose. You get a training contract or you don't get a training contract. Success, failure. You pass this exam, you fail this exam. Success, failure. It's all the time like that. But actually, when you enter into the work, once you're into the law firms, for example, or just generally in life, actually so much stuff is not a zero-sum game anymore. It's an infinite game. Like in business, if another coach succeeds, I'm happy for them. That's great. Why does them succeeding mean that I can't succeed? In fact, if I am their cheerleader and I help them and I support them, that makes them look better. Hopefully, it helps them. It also helps me because I learn from them, I grow, maybe I get more exposure, all the rest of it. And I think it's about understanding that actually, one, success and failure are not opposites. And two, you have to understand in every situation you're in, is it a zero sum game? Is it an infinite game? Because I think half the time it's like we cut ourselves at the knees because we think actually we shouldn't be doing that, we shouldn't be supporting that, when actually that would have helped us. It's quite
Yeah.
unusual. I don't know if you've experienced that in business or in law.
Yeah, it is like success and failure are opposites. However, in some certain cases, I feel like it has to be, because with, let's say you're dealing with a client and you mess up a case, that's a failure. Yes, it's a lesson, but for the client, that's a failure. So go on.
Well, I was thinking that it's interesting you're saying, well, that's a failure. But actually, let's say you mess up with a client. Let's say you give bad advice. Let's say you even give negligent advice. Well, I think failure is a very sort of Daily Mail term to just put that's a failure. It's actually, no, what's happened there? Like maybe there was a miscommunication, maybe something happened, maybe you misunderstood, maybe you just got divorced the day before and you did something wrong. Okay, so in that circumstance, you didn't give good advice. Does that mean you're a bad person? Does that mean you're a bad lawyer? Does that mean you've always given bad advice? Does that mean you should never give advice again? No, none of those things. Probably not anyway, without more context. So the point is here is it's easy to go, okay, that's a failure, but no, what do we actually mean? What's happened here? Let's just understand what's happened and then work towards how can we make sure that doesn't happen again. I'm not sure that I would be like, okay, this negligent act is a failure. Like, okay, perhaps it could amount to something which is not good enough in a certain context. But I think this is where we have to be careful of these really quite generic terms, because otherwise we take it to heart. And this is the damage. It's thinking, because I screwed up once, because I didn't pass that exam, because I didn't do that thing, I am a failure as a human being. That's how hard it hits us. You're not a failure as a human being. Something didn't work out, or maybe one day you screwed up. But you know what? You're human. So let's see how we can learn from this and move forward.
I think I've had situations where bad thing. So when working in law, it's like you do something bad and it's like that's bad, and you do something good you do something good and it's like, oh, you're just doing your job. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like it's nothing to shout about. You're just doing your job. And
yeah.
I've had like circumstances where doing something bad has been. So I'll actually give you an example. I was working in Sheffield, right? I had to go to Liverpool with a client to go to the Home Office to submit a visa application and like support them through the visa process as their application was being decided. I traveled from Sheffield to Liverpool with all their documents, right? I get to the meeting with the client. We're getting on really, really well. I turn up, the Home Office go, okay, could I have the passports, please? I go in the bag. The passports are not there.
Oh
I'm
no.
like, the Home Office are like, we're going to have to put this on hold. We can't process this without the passports, obviously. It was literally days before Christmas, so they were going to close. I was like, oh my gosh. I call the office. I'm like, the passports are not here. It wasn't my mistake, although it kind of was indirectly because I should have checked the bag before leaving. But my paralegal had left the passports in the scanner and I'd assumed it was all there. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is literally the end of the world. And like bad things end up being worse when, like, for me anyway. But like, luckily, my manager was like, look, it's not your fault. It's not your fault at all. It's the paralegal's fault. She left it in the scanner. And it's like, you know what? It's everyone's fault. Like, we shouldn't, this shouldn't have happened. The client ended up making a complaint. It ended up being a really, really, like, it ruined my Christmas. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And it was like, I feel like for me, the things that went wrong in law, even if they weren't that big of a deal, because in the end, it all worked out. We ended up ordering a taxi from Sheffield to Liverpool with the passports in it. So in the end, the application was processed and it was all fine, but it left such a negative thing on me that I couldn't enjoy Christmas.
Yeah. I can hear, and that is like, that is like your worst nightmare as a lawyer. It's something going wrong like that. And it's often the simple things when I have seen mistakes being made. It's that lack of attention to detail in that moment, which is the same thing here. The passports were in the scanner, the paralegal didn't check, but then you didn't double check. It's that it's the very small things. And it's often the case that it's those sorts of things, whether it's a deadline that's missed, whatever, that are overlooked. But I wonder, you brought that up in the context of us talking about success and failure. Out of interest, why did that story come up for you in the context of us discussing failure?
Because it just feels like a big mistake and a bit of a failure in terms of like attention to detail, number one. Number two, client expectations. And, we went from having really great conversations. I built brilliant rapport with them. And then from them, then starting to I don't know, trying to disclude me and like so we had to wait in the home office for a while. They started like speaking amongst themselves in a language I don't understand, and they started to not like me. I got this feeling, so I was just like, oh my gosh, I have failed my clients, and that's how it felt. It was heavy.
And that's really hard, isn't it? And I think, that sort of thing stays with you. And I think that's also how we learn not to make the same mistake twice often. It's when you do something that really hits hard. In terms of this, I hear what you're saying, that maybe you didn't do something right. That internalizes for you this feeling of failure. But would you feel any different now? Would you do that any differently now? How would you advise someone if they were to say they found themselves in a similar situation?
I think right now, I think completely differently about failure, as we've mentioned, only because I just think so many things have happened since then. I've literally, since then, just to name a few, like I've been made redundant, I've moved countries, I've gone through a visa process of my own, I've built up a business, I've quit a profession. So many things have happened where it's like now, if that thing happened, I'd just be like, it's literally not the end of the world. We will try to resolve it and we will try to find solutions, but it is not the end of the world. I was listening to a podcast, Diary of a CEO, where he was interviewing, can't remember who, and I can't remember which company it was, but he was telling a story about failure, right? So there was an employee for a company. Let's say like Amazon for argument's sake. So someone was working for Amazon and they had screwed up a like £6 million deal or something. Somebody asked the founder, like Jeff Bezos, are you going to fire that employee because he's massively screwed up on a £6 million or dollar deal? And Jeff goes, it might not be Jeff, by the way, but I'm just giving this as an example. Jeff goes, are you kidding me? I've literally spent $6 million on teaching him a valuable lesson. And that's the reframing of failure. The guy messed up, but he's been taught a very, very, very valuable lesson that he will not make that mistake again.
And I think that's a really key point that you mentioned there, which is actually, as managers, as leaders in law firms, we need to really improve our relationship with making mistakes in a legal context, and how we support those in the team when they do make mistakes. Because actually, you hear these dreadful stories of particularly juniors trying to cover up their tracks when they have made a mistake because they fear getting fired or losing their practicing certificate or something. And actually, at that point, normally it's not that bad, it's not irretrievable. But because they're so fearful of management, they cover it up. And then it gets to the point where something diabolical really does happen and they end up getting struck off. This stuff happens reasonably frequently. And I think, this is another thing where management, law firms, leadership needs to step up, because actually, if we have a slightly more compassionate industry where we actually have proper teamwork, where we support our juniors, where we accept accountability for our own actions, like you did just then. Yes, the paralegal 100% should never have left passports and the photocopier. However, you also acknowledge your mistake, because yes, you should have double checked that before getting on a train to Liverpool, you know. So we all play our part. And I think one of the things that often happens in law firms is it's just, let's point at somebody else and pass on the blame because we have to cover our own arse. And that's not a good culture. That's pretty toxic. So I think, actually you're right, you touched on something important here. There's something around to improve our relationship with failure, both as individuals and as a collective in law firms. We have to actually come together and I think find more compassion for ourselves, but also for those around us. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Holly.
Yes, but as you mention, it's like it's such a competitive environment
Mm.
that people almost thrive off other people's failures and like, oh, they've done this wrong, but I've not done that wrong. I've done this. And it's like everyone's always trying to up one on the other person. It's like people do something wrong or make a mistake, and everyone else is like pointing the finger, like, I can't believe they did that. Like they can't be good at their job or whatever. But you've got to look at the wider context, what's going on with that person. Have they had the correct training? Is everything okay with them? Like, I don't
Mm.
know. I think you are right. We need to create a more compassionate environment, a more supportive culture so that we feel comfortable and secure in making mistakes, because making mistakes, as I mentioned in that example, is the pathway to really becoming a great lawyer.
I think I'd add to that. I think it's a pathway. I think it's a hard pathway to take. I think the other pathway potentially to take, given the sort of environments we have, is it goes back to a piece of advice I was given as a first seat trainee, which is, people will forget the 99 things out of 100 that you did right, as you alluded to earlier on, Holly, but they will remember the one thing that you F up. So for me, I would always spend extra time on things. I would double check, I would triple check, and all that good stuff. Probably to the point of being a bit neurotic or a little bit slow when I was a junior. But actually, I'd rather that rather than screw up. So I think you've always got to think of that as well. Actually, is it worth you being labelled a little bit slow or a little bit pedantic over detail or screwing up? I think within all of that as well, it is that wider context of what you just said of there is always a solution. We're not in a job where, we're not in an operating theatre. We're not surgeons. No one's going to die. I mean, I'm not maybe talking about human rights lawyers here. I can't speak for them. But for the rest of us, normal lawyers, everyday life, actually, no one's going to die. And I think it's that thing of you learn this with age. There always is a solution to every problem. It may not be the solution you want, but there is a solution. And the world will keep spinning. Your life will not end. So it's somehow knowing that and, I don't know, keeping going, that the world doesn't implode because you got one thing wrong. So another point here is that you've mentioned feeling like a failure in the context of perhaps making mistakes, but my experience of feeling like a failure, I think in my life and law, etc., well, it's on a smaller scale. For example, it's, every day, maybe not doing something completely perfectly, having a document massively redlined by a senior, not getting the appraisal grade I wanted, maybe getting a slightly negative comment in an appraisal, not getting the exam grade I wanted. I think particularly when we're in that, highly competitive environment called law, actually not being perfect, because 99.9% of us are perfectionists as lawyers, not being perfect just feels like this complete and utter personal failure. And I think that's part of the whole inner critic thing, imposter syndrome. You tear yourself to shreds because you think, I didn't do that thing perfectly, therefore I'm a failure. I'm not a good lawyer. And I think that can be a really, really detrimental mindset. And did you experience that as well, Holly, or was it different for you?
No, I don't. I never saw myself as a failure, even though I knew there were better people than me, because I know my capabilities, and even if I didn't get the best results, for example, or even if didn't get the best outcomes, or I'm just giving like vague like examples here because I can't think of any specific ones. But I never ever thought to myself like, oh, you're just not good enough, like you're a failure. I never ever thought that because there's no point thinking like that. And even in the context of if a client came to me, like you get an initial call and you give a little bit of advice and you give them details on how you can work with them and stuff like that, and tell them about the service, etc. And if they came to me and they were like, look, this is my case, da 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 da, even in that context, I'd be like, right, in my head, I'd be thinking, right, I know someone who's actually brilliant at that type of case, and it's not me. And
Mm.
I would then go and speak to that person. I wouldn't think, oh, I'm a failure because I can't do this type of case. I'd think, no, I have my strengths. I know what they are. I'm confident in them. And I think that in my own way, I am successful. Doesn't mean it's the same way as everyone else. And I still think the same. But no, I never thought that.
And out of interest, see, this is where I'm wondering if different law firms are different, because so I started off in the Magic Circle, where it was kind of like a melting pot of the highest achievers you're ever going to meet. I get there, massive imposter syndrome, feeling like I'd somehow mistakenly been given the ticket, like, oh, how did we let her in there? How did she sneak in the back door? I was waiting to be found out at any given moment. But, like, you think you might be good at something, right? And then you'll speak to the person next to you. You think, oh, okay, well, I speak French and German, so I'm, I suppose quite good at languages, blah, blah, blah. You speak to the person next to you, they speak 5 languages fluently, and then another 10, pretty well. The next person is a concert pianist in their free time. The next person is actually really, really lovely girl. The next person was literally the double for Hermione in the Harry Potter movies. Really lovely woman. But yeah, I mean, like, honestly, we had freaking movie stars in my intake. Movie stars. I just wonder. I don't mean this as there's better or there's worse firms or whatever else. But honestly, I felt like I'd just been skyrocketed to the, I don't even know whether you call it Sandhurst, Navy SEALs, whatever. It was the elite of the elite. How on earth could little me ever be good enough? And then, so every time I made the slightest slip up, just normal things you'd learn in the context of your everyday job because you don't start out as a partner, that inner feeling of insecurity was just compounded. And so I wonder if there's a bit of a difference there. I don't know, because I know that, when I worked at other firms, there wasn't there weren't movie stars in the building. That's all I'm going to say. With
Yeah,
no
I do.
disrespect to anyone.
I do agree. I do agree. I think in different environments you have this different feeling. And I think had I been in your situation, I probably would have felt the same. But I mean, I was in comfortable firms where you're not getting any movie stars in Sheffield, that's for sure. But I did actually when I
You in Sheffield, you make it sound so down and out. It's a really good city, right?
you haven't even been.
I went once. I went one afternoon on the train up from Nottingham and back again when I was at uni.
Oh, interesting.
We'll have to do an episode now on the one trip to Sheffield, I think. But anyway, we digress.
However, I remember my first day at CMS, and that's a big firm. It's an international firm, and people were turning up. So we had like you have like a HR introduction day when you're on your first day, and you've got other people there and stuff. People were turning up, and you could tell they really wanted to prove themselves. They felt like they needed to prove themselves. So, gosh, you sat there, we were waiting for the HR to come in, and people are coming out with all sorts of stuff. I've done this, I'm like this, da da da, da. And I'm just sat there like, geez, not like out. I didn't feel like out of my depth. I just felt like, why do you feel the need to talk about your life story in front of, and like bragging in front of people you don't even know? But I just like sat quiet. I was like, I don't need to prove myself. I don't really care in actual fact. So yeah, but had I been in your situation from the offset, starting my career in a crazy, massive, cool firm like that, I might be telling you a different story.
Do you know, I'm just remembering as you say that, I also went to one of those, like, well done, you've got a training contract days. And of course, it attracts all the people who have been given their offer. It doesn't mean they've accepted their offer. And I remember sitting in like the atrium at the front or whatever with all the people, and everyone was very lovely around me. There was this one guy across on another table, and he was like, "Oh yeah, so I've got offers from like A&O, CC, Linklater, Thrushfields," and it just went like on and on. I was just like, he was like, "Yeah, I don't know what to, I just don't know which one to accept," and I was like, honestly, you've got, you always get a few of those personalities thrown in for good luck,
You
but
do.
okay, so just to wrap up on this episode then, let's both maybe answer this question, but to you, Holly, what one piece of advice would you give to somebody who's in a law firm, maybe who doubts themselves a lot, bit of a perfectionist, has the imposter syndrome, and they really fear failure, they hate screwing things up, and feeling like they're a failure at what they do, etc. Like, what piece of advice would you give them?
One thing that I was always told to do, in actual fact, when I was working at CMS, which was a nice place to work actually, and they told us that, like, on our little team, they were like, we got a lot of negativity from a lot of internal people, I'll say. And they said, and one of my questions was like, we're getting so much negativity. How do we stay positive and not feel like we are failures in a way? And they said, whenever you get something good, a nice email from someone saying you've done a brilliant job, or maybe a client said, thank you so much, or maybe someone said to you, you were such a helpful, lovely person. Thanks so much for helping me with whatever. Save it, put it in a folder, and when you feel down or feel like you are a failure, refer to the folder and remember all the good things that you've done. And also take that folder with you to your appraisal. So I did, and I kept everything, and I had so much good feedback, and I took it to my appraisal, and my appraisals were always so positive because they were like, whoa, yeah, you got this, people said this about you, and it was so nice. So that's one little tiny thing that you can do to contribute to not feeling like a failure.
I absolutely love that. I absolutely love that. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because that's kind of like your own appreciation file. And I don't know if you know this, but there's actually science, like scientific research that's been done that shows the positive effect on the brain of that. That reinforcement, it helps sort of counter the negativity bias and actually helps you feel more confident. It improves your well-being. There are scientific studies showing that. So I think, that's such a powerful thing to do. And I love that practical step, because that's something that people can really start actioning from this moment onwards.
Yeah.
The,
What about
the
you?
thing, yeah, the thing I would just add to that is just to say that, I suppose, from the psychology perspective, knowing that your thoughts aren't who you are. So your negative thoughts of I'm a failure, I screwed up, I'm this, I'm that, they are just thought patterns. They are narratives that are ingrained in your psyche. If you are used to thinking in a way which is sort of self-deprecating, self-blaming, negative, telling yourself you're failing, those, if you like, are your default thought patterns. So your brain will go straight to that. That doesn't mean it's true. And actually, the more work you do on yourself, the more, say, meditation or therapy or coaching or any of these kind of things to improve your own self-awareness, what that does is it increases the space between you and your thoughts. So you can catch that thought and think, I can see right now that I'm thinking I'm a failure, but I'm choosing to not own that, because I'm not a failure. And that's going to feel really hard at first, but after time, if you keep practicing that, you distance yourself from it, and actually you take on a new mindset. And that is quite literally how you rewire your brain, and it is completely possible.